we are still suffering, right, from the after effects of a recession that we don't know, how bad those after effects are going to be and how lasting the outcomes are, right? And it's interesting, I think, that this one was caused by a huge stock market meltdown and then an economic downturn thereafter. A mere 7 years ago, or 7 years prior to that, we had another massive bubble, stock market meltdown, massive recession, right? And we put in place a bunch of things that we thought would make sure this didn't happen again. And since it hadn't happened, a stock market meltdown and economic meltdown of that magnitude for over 70 years, right? We thought if we put in place this whole set of fixes, Sarbanes-Oxley, lots of new regulations and the like, we'd take care of that. But instead of taking 70 years, it took 7 years. So what I want to argue is that none of the fixes that we've put in place in the wake of the 2008 crash, meltdown, will make it any less likely that we'll have another one and another one soon. And we have to think a little bit differently this time about this crash to get a better result than that. And I'm going to argue that there's a culprit and that we can fix it. We have to fix the game that's being played and the way the game is being played. So what I'd argue is that there's been a very definitive shift that's happened in the world in which we occupy. And I'm going to draw a line January 1, 1977, which I'll explain a little bit later as to why it's drawn exactly then. And a few odd things to note about the 34 years from that period to the present versus the 34 years previous. So real returns on the stock market, right? This is real returns to the S&P 500. If you index those and said it's 100 for the prior period, it's 85 for the subsequent period. So it's 7.6% compound annual return real for that first period and 6.5 for the second period, 15% lower. So shareholders have done worse systematically in this period afterwards. But even worse, if you said, what's the volatility? How much risk do shareholders have to put up with to earn those returns? It's risen by 15%. So lower returns, more volatility, and total market meltdowns in that 34-year period, 0, and in the subsequent 34-year period, 2. Right? So a exceedingly much worse impact for shareholders and for the economy in the subsequent year. Now, somebody has actually done quite well. CEO compensation, and these are in real terms. These are in 1976 dollars inflated to 2010. A CEO compensation has gone up 16.5 times. So they've done well, and somebody else has done really well. Hedge fund managers. And so this is 2008, personal cash compensation of the top hedge fund managers. So this is their take-home pay. Think of this as their pay packet, only it's kind of a big one. And this was in the year when the stock market went down about 50%. And this is what they earned. So they made kind of a lot of money. So the question is, how do you get a situation where it gets worse, so much worse for shareholders, and better for these other folks, when we thought it would be the opposite? And to understand that, I think we have to understand that there are two very different games being played. One is the real game, and another is an expectations game. Right? In the real game, companies produce real products or services, sell them to real people for real money, earn a real income at the end of the year. The expectations game is a game in which people look at the real game and imagine what's going to happen in the future. How do we know they're doing that? Well, we know that during the history of the S&P 500, it's traded at an average multiple over real current earnings of 17 times. So in some sense, you're paying 1 time for what's really happening and 16 times for what you expect will happen in the future. How does that work out? Let's just take Microsoft as an example. Microsoft, This is its stock performance in blue versus its net income performance in red over the last decade. And what you can see is that after the market crashed last time, Microsoft was as high as $58 in 1999, and it crashed down to $21. Since then, it's been between 20 and 30 bucks a share, adjusted for splits, for 10 years, while its net income has more than doubled. Its revenues have more than tripled. So one of the finest companies in the world, finest performing companies in the world, doing wonderful, and nothing's happened to the stock price. Why is that? It's because there's a schism between expectations and reality. The real game versus the expectations game. You can have these gigantic schisms between the two. Now, why do I say that between the January 1, 1977 is such an important break point? It's because in that year, for the first time, the real game and the expectations game were intermingled in a way that hadn't happened before. In 1976, two scholars, Mike Jensen and Bill Mechnick, wrote an influential article, in fact, the most influential article in the history of anything that's been written in the academic business press, that made the argument that there is a schism between what owners of firms, the shareholders, want versus what managers will want to do for them. They called the owners the principals, they had managers the agents, and they called it a principal-agent problem, so that the agents, management, actually maximizes their own value rather than maximizes shareholder value. So they said, this is a big problem, and the only way we can fix this is to give our managers stock-based compensation. And it was a deceptively simple premise, which is that means if shareholders get rich, managers will get rich. We'll give them stock options, and they'll both get rich together. Their interests will be aligned, and everything will be fine. And now shareholders will do much better. Now we see from this chart what happened in the wake of that. Shareholders have done much worse. There's way more volatility. The economy gets wrecked, and CEOs do really, really well. Right? So what was the matter with the premise, right? Because that's the fundamental premise of the argument. This will align when it actually doesn't seem to have aligned at all, right? Looks clear? For help, what I'd argue is we have to go and look at another game, and this is the NFL. In the NFL, there's also a real game. On Sundays, teams go out on the field and play 60 real minutes. There are real passes, real rushes, real touchdowns, real field goals, a real scorer, a real winner, and a real loser. Right? There's also an associated expectations game. What is that expectations game? Betting on NFL football. What happens in betting on NFL football between Monday and Saturday? People imagine what's going to happen in the future, just like you imagine what's going to happen to the future of a company, and on the basis of that, you bet on your team. And the bookies establish a point spread, right, to even the money on either side. So the underdog gets given points, and the favorite has to give points. And on the basis of that, right, you've got betting. What does the NFL say about linking of the real game with the expectations game? What do they say? Are you allowed, as the quarterback of the New England Patriots, to bet on the New England Patriots or anybody else? No. What happens if you do? You get kicked out for life. Interesting, then when we compare that set of games, that real and expectations game, to the world of business. Rather than you getting kicked out for life for playing in the expectations game, if you're the quarterback, i.e. the CEO, you're not only encouraged, you're generally forced to do so. Right? So instead of the NFL, where in 1962 Pete Rozelle set the tone, this is Alex Karras on your left, and Hornig on your left of the thing on the right, the best defensive and best offensive player in the league in 1962, both got kicked out for a year for betting on football because they're so careful about mixing up the real game and the expectations game. Now, what were they worried about? Right? They're worried about if you have a player playing in the expectations game, they will influence the real game and potentially wreck the real game. They're worried about things like tanking and point shaving and all sorts of things of that sort. Why don't we worry about that when it comes to CEOs? Why is it very different in that world? The answer is there is no answer. It isn't different at all. And that's not because CEOs and other executives are bad people at all, but we've set up a game where they play in the real game, or in the expectations game. And we have to go to football to again understand why that's problematic. If you think about it, let's go back to 2007. New England Patriots have the best regular season record in the history of NFL football. They go 16-0, better than 14-0 for the Miami Dolphins. And in the first 8 games of the season, they win in the real game, 8-0, and they actually win in the expectations game. They beat the point spread 8 times. What happens in the back half of the season? What happens to the expectations? Point spreads widen. So much so, interesting enough, if you're into NFL betting, that in the last 8 games of the 2007 season, the New England Patriots faced the 3 largest point spreads in the recorded history of NFL betting prior or since. And they went 2-6 against the spread in the back half for a mediocre 10-6 record against the spread. Not nearly as good as the Cleveland Browns, who went 12-4 against the spread. And if you think about it, their quarterback, journeyman Derek Anderson, who's bounced around the league, if he would have been in the world of business, right, he would have made more money on his stock options than Tom Brady, who set records for the most touchdown passes, the highest passer rating, blah, 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 all of that. This is what executives figured out. So this era of aligning the interests of shareholders and management, which started in 1980, in the early days of that, CEOs said, yes, all I have to do is increase performance in the real market, and I'll get wealthy on the basis of my stock options. Then they realized, oops, it isn't about increasing real performance, right? If you're Microsoft, you're sitting around increasing real performance for an entire decade, and nothing is happening to your stock price. They realized it's about increasing expectations. So in the mid-90s, an entirely new to the world thing happened in the world of business. Something called earnings guidance was created, where CEOs would actually go to Wall Street and guide them on what their earnings were going to be. Why would that be? Why would that suddenly be the case? Why did guidance suddenly arise? Because CEOs figured out that the only way their stock price can go up is if expectations about future earnings increase. Not current earnings, expectations about future earnings. So you go to hype your stock. How many multi-billion-dollar stock accounting frauds did we have prior to 1977? Answer, none. How many since? Lots. When they figured out that's the way to increase expectations about the future. That was the second era, right? So first was focus on real earnings. Next was focus on expectations. Then they learned the New England Patriot lesson and said, you know what? You can't keep expectations increasing forever. In fact, you can't keep them increasing for very long. And so then what happened? You had executives saying, my job is to take charge, take the job, scoot expectations up, and then do what? Get the hell out, cash my stock options, and then let it fall, right? So there's been this dramatic shortening in the tenure of CEOs, right, of corporate America. People think it's because they're getting fired. There's actually no evidence that the rate of firing of CEOs is any greater than it ever has been. They're quitting, right? And that's why when the stock goes back down, the new CEO can come in and get stock-based compensation at a low level, ride it up, get out, let it fall back down, ride it up, get out. That's how you can have this schism, right? That's how you can have the results I showed for how badly shareholders are doing while CEOs are doing great. So it turns out that while we thought, and the entire business world thinks, it's absolute dogma, that stock-based compensation aligns the interests of shareholders and management, it does exactly, precisely the opposite. It does exactly precisely the opposite and makes CEOs and other executives more interested in the expectations market and the real market and jerking around expectations. And you know who's piled on to that? Hedge funds. What are hedge funds interested? What's the one thing hedge funds are interested in? Volatility. They make money when there's volatility. They're not interested in positive performance. They don't care. Positive, negative, they don't care as long as there is vacillation. So we now have an alliance of hedge funds and senior managements who are both interested in rapid changes in the expectations market. That's why we have bubbles and crashes of epic proportions. That's why we're going to continue to have more of them. It doesn't matter what oversight there is of companies. I can guarantee you the following. We will not have another bubble based on highly hyped internet stocks, and we're not going to have another bubble based on subprime mortgages, right? We've eliminated those. But we haven't eliminated the likelihood of a bubble of any other causes, and guess what? There are about 1 billion other causes of the next bubble. Until we revisit the question of the role of stock-based compensation in our economic system. And what I'd argue is on this front, it's easy. All we have to do is pay attention to the NFL, and we'll get our act together. And until we do that, we've got a problem looming. This is all documented in this book, which is Fixing the Game, which comes out in May. This is my first public speech on the book. The publishers don't like you to speak about it prior to launch, but there it is. When it comes out, if you're interested in the subject, you might want to buy it. Thank you very much.